Hello, thank you so much. And I genuinely thank you so much for inviting me to present and for sharing my work. I never find myself in the opportunity or in a space where I don't have to already explain the historical component of my research. So that just cut a good 10 minutes off of my presentation. So thank you for that. I am from UC San Diego and about to become from San Diego State University. I am a theater practitioner, a museum educator, and an arts consultant. So my work is quite interdisciplinary. That's kind of part of my nature. I look at everything and try to put all the pieces together and find connections. So my work explores memory studies, performance, and alternative memorial spaces, all as intersecting places of remembrance. So I actually first started thinking about this in 2008 when I was working on my master's degree. I'm already thinking about the next thing ahead. And I visited the Powstania Museum, and there I saw theater all around me. That's kind of the way, if I had glasses on, they would just be a theater lens. And so I wondered if everyone who goes through the museum space, if they can experience it in any way the same way I do, having such a deep knowledge about Powstania. And so that was initially going to be my research location until this museum opened. So I rushed over last year, and about a year ago now, I was able to spend an afternoon here at the museum, and that ended up being such a huge component of my dissertation and my research. It actually pivoted quite a bit of it. Becoming my entire first chapter, and so I hate that I can't give you any spoilers. So I had to rework a little bit of this. But I wanted to let you know kind of how things begin. It always starts from, it begins from who we are. So the quest for memory is the search for one's history. And so I really started to look at memory studies coming from encounters with autobiographical narratives and as acts of memorialization through my extended family. Every time I sat at the kitchen table with my chochareña, hearing her stories of going through Siberia, Kazakhstan, all the way through to India, and listening to my babcha, and suddenly hearing that there were more and more people in our Polish community in Detroit and Windsor and Toronto, and hearing everyone having such a similar experience, for me growing up, I just assumed everybody knew about this. And so I wanted to, through my PhD, I wanted to explore how these representations of ritualized cultural memorialization, all the processions I was in as a child, and how they're actually performances of memory, and how can these performances of memory function as an alternative site of memory transmission from, for instance, my chocha to me. So last year I had the opportunity to participate in the ceremony on the 17th of September in Warsaw. Thank you so much. And it was like things had just come full circle. 7-year-old me and much not 7-year-old me. So you can imagine being in high school in Canada and going through World War II history, hitting all the benchmarks, all the markers, and then waiting and going, okay, we learned about this, that, okay. And then flipping ahead in the pages and wondering, hey, where's this part? Where's the part about the deportations to Siberia? And my history teacher, bless her, had no idea. What are you talking about? And I said, what do you mean, what am I talking about? I have a handful of family members who could tell you about it. And that's when I realized that there was a silence in the history books. And to me, it felt like a non-recognition and a dismissal of the trauma experienced by my family and so many Poles. And so at that time, I sort of found that I positioned myself and my body as a repository for these experiences. I kind of started to feel like I had to take it upon myself to carry these memories forward, to hear all the stories I could, and really try to understand their experiences, all the while knowing I could never understand their experiences. So these memories became just more than integral to my cultural identity. post-war Canada and US, I'm on both sides of the border, so I consider myself a North American citizen. Newly settled Poles who survived the war were creating and forging their own communities. So I caught these fragmented conversations, and I started to realize that there was more to it. People were having these such similar experiences. I thought everyone was together. I didn't understand that this happened all up and down the eastern borderlands. So this feeling like it was inscribed into my body, my study as a PhD student was about the storytelling process and how does it transfer intergenerationally. So the family stories are what would be called the archive, and when we receive them, they become this corporeal storehouse, these embodied practices. So when I say I'm a theater practitioner, I am really looking at the body in space, including the museum space. We speak so much of memory because there's so little of it left. Pierre Nora was influential in the 1980s memory boom, and this would be around the time when suddenly there was a great interest in Holocaust and genocide studies, and that is when all of a sudden people's personal and autobiographical experiences suddenly became a little more valid in the historical archives. Suddenly people paid more attention. And so the activity of remembering and the experience of receiving the memory and being witness to those memories contributed to this intuitive process associated with the reinscribing of memories and the passing down of these stories. And so once, I'll put it this way, the study of memory and transmission of that memory has so much to owe to the early scholars in the 80s and even beyond that is what is now known as Holocaust and genocide studies. So because of the lack of archival or sanctioned documentation that addressed the trauma of the Sibirasi and my family that suffered in Siberia and beyond, I found myself trying to understand more about the horrors of the Holocaust as my way into what I could understand about what was happening with our family in Siberia. I'm just gonna say with our family, because I feel like this is the only time I don't have to go outside of that. So this is how I began to understand the lingering trauma I could see in my grandparents. So don't worry about this, but the key points of the inquiry, what I wanted to do with my study and being here, I had a couple case studies. I wanted to look at communal structures of historical and collective memory, and I'll talk about the different kinds of memory in a minute. I think something that we take for granted, we just think and recall. So I want to look at what moves beyond the established post-World War II memory studies and then recognizes the shift that's happening in the third generations. I really started to wonder, what about those that come after me? What about the fourth generation? I feel like right now we're in this middle section. So I'm really interested, like the museum pointed out, who comes next? So I consider how memory is transferred generationally. How can performances of collective remembrance encourage storytelling among communities? So the very experience of having ceremonies and rituals and talking about this as a group, how can we inspire more storytelling? And how do we understand the burden and labor of memory that accumulates intergenerationally and transgenerationally, not just between each other, but farther than that, beyond personal generations, but to extended historical generations. So how do we ensure that the intergenerational transmission, how can we ensure that maybe it reduces the horrors of the past? And that's one of the things that I think became really important at the start of the aggression against Ukraine. Suddenly, everything that I was researching landed right in front of me. There we go. So this is how my brain works. It's frightening. But I started thinking about memory in one way, and then I realized there's all these different types of memory, but they all intersect, and at that very heart of it, it should be a heart where it says personal memory. That's our stories. That's my Bapcha's story. That's my Chacha's story. And from there, you can go down to collective memory. Those are the stories of everyone who experienced it, and they all found a community together. This is a community together, that we have a collective shared experience of being second or third generation. So then there's the cultural memory. That's the function of this museum. This museum helps keep the cultural memory alive and moving forward through the exhibits, through the different activities and community engagement opportunities, and also through rituals and commemorative activities like this weekend. And so then there is prosthetic memory. Don't worry about it, that's chapter 2. I'm not gonna go into it. But post-memory is what's really important for us here. Post-memory is the memory that kind of comes after, and I'll get more into that. But, oh, there's a button. Okay, so here's the overlap of what does that look like. So commemorations and rituals, digital communities, social media platforms. I was really inspired by the Kresy-Siberia Facebook group. About the way that these virtual communities came together. And then over here we've got museums and memorials. And then prosthetic memory later. So, there we go. So post-memory. The relationship that the generations after those who witnessed cultural or collective trauma bear to the experiences of those who came before. Experience that they remember only by means of the stories, images, and behaviors among which they grew up. But these experiences were transmitted to them so deeply and effectively as to seem to constitute memories of their own right. I have this kind of once removed. Because I spent so much time with my chochas and babchas, I felt like their memories were kind of like my own now. And this is something that Marianne Hirsch, if you're interested in kind of more about this, her texts and her books look at her experience being the daughter of Holocaust survivors and from Romania, and how she started to identify and feel like she was so connected that she felt like sometimes they were her own, living memorialization. So I wonder, can individual performances of the collective remembrance encourage more storytelling among communities using kind of post-memory as a way to think about it? But how do we remember? How do we even get to that? Well, when we don't have the stories anymore, we have what's left. We have the archive. So these are, there's Wujek Stasha's mom, Babcia Yasha. But these are kind of what I'm left with. And I imagine many of you have similar kind of documents and photos. And so what do they mean? But they mean different things to different people. But what they also evoke is a feeling of not only their presence, but also their absence. And that's a part of the post-memory. They're also points of memory. And for instance, as Marianne Hirsch suggests, photos can impact descendants in this way because photographs are often read as traces, material connections to a lost past. And because many photograph images have survived, even though their subjects did not, photography provides a particularly powerful medium of post-memory. So when you go through the museum space, you will see a lot of photographs, enlarged, small, within cases. You will see the photographs, and this is something that I think kind of the museum and I share in how we look at it, is that these are all triggers. And sometimes there's you know that moment when you just kind of see something and unexpectedly you're like, it just gets you? That is one of those moments that they talk about in terms of the traces of memory, the points of memory, the punctum. It kind of pierces you. And that's what a museum can do. That's what memory can do. That's what storytelling can do. It can grab you in a way that hopefully, for someone who's not related to anyone in the museum or shares the story, hopefully maybe encourages me a bit of empathy on their part, maybe the opportunity to research more, just a little bit more compelling. So the discoveries kind of keep going. So my prababcia Zofia is here. I only just recently was given her pen from Africa, where she was a school teacher. I'm a teacher. And so it was one of those, like, now what? But then I also was given this document, this booklet, but we can't read, where part of it, she used this pen to write down her story, her testimony of being in Siberia once they landed in Africa, and she was in the Koja camp with my chocha. And now I go, what do I do with this? And so the pen I'm keeping, that's mine now. But one of the things that's important is thinking about how do these items, these belongings, they're not just objects, they're stories. They have histories. When you go through the museum space, you will see these objects, and I encourage you to think about not just the signage, but think about objects that are similar that you might have, so that these objects and these photos can become surrogates in many ways for the experiences and the stories that we have. And that's one of the ways that I think that we can keep also the transmission of familial stories going, if there are any objects, if there are any digitized copies of objects. So the act of storytelling that accompanies all of these artifacts, it helps to anchor, like I said, a point of memory, especially for those future generations that may not have just any type of concept. So post-memory plus. So the connection to the past is actually mediated not by recall, but how we imagine the projection and the creation. So that's the part where I can't understand what it's like to have gone through Siberia. And you're right, there's not a lot of movies. There's not a lot of pictures. It's, I think at one point we used Dr. Zhivago as the closest thing we could think of. And that was it. And so this is where the generation next and the generation next is kind of trying to fill in some blanks. And with each filling in the blanks, we are getting a little bit more distanced. So I'm particularly interested in the third generation. And so highlighting how the acts of recalling the past can help pass down memory. Now, Marianne Hirsch, who was one of the prominent scholars who came up with post-memory, came up with post-memory specifically after she was reading Mouse by Art Spiegelman. And so one of the reasons that in 2008 I also came across Mouse, and I looked at comic books and graphic novels as another performative space, because you can use art, you can use drawing, you can use everything available to you to convey messages and stories, but without necessarily needing the stage space, the costumes, the script, and things that only happen once. This is text. It exists. So it's a unique platform for audiences to become witnesses to historical and cultural trauma and the process of introduction. So I look at comic books as an alternative form of remembrance because, again, it also is resistant to erasure. And that's one of the things that I have found that just is the most compelling part of my research in the last 7 years has been every time we push forward with our stories, with our babcia stories, with our memory of being told those stories, if we were so lucky, or finding these documents or objects, is that every time that happens, that does, as my Chocharenia said, that was how she stuck it to Stalin, because she survived, because she had grandchildren, because her story has passed on. And that's one of the things that I think of when I think of storytelling as an act of resistance. So it can be, performance can be up on the stage, performance can be full shows, but every time we make a choice to share a story, to tell a stranger about something that they might not have known, that is an act of remembrance as resistance. And so this is a way that we can help construct the third generation and maybe the fourth generation's transcultural memory. So how do we apply this to kind of today's present day? Like I said, it just sort of happened that way. I never in a million years would have thought that I would have been experiencing watching the news and watching Russia invade another sovereign territory. And here we are. And so what I want to highlight here is, again, whether you put a fancy name to it or not, I think we've all felt it. I think we've all experienced it. And so here, this would be, for instance, me, as I see it, my generation. But then there's my mother, second, my babcia, and, prababcia. And this is how many times we've seen these types of traumas in, our region, in our area, and how it's passed down. So it becomes the memory, the post-memory. And what I'm saying, the second and third generation, or the third and fourth generation, what we're going through is this post memory. Specifically, we're like kind of close to it, but again, not so close. And with that little bit of distance, I think the difference that's happening with our generation is that we have a little bit of emotional distance, which maybe allows us to approach some of these memories and traumatic histories in a way that helps us to contextualize them a little bit. And again, this is all theoretical. This is just my opinion on how this is moving forward, but I've really appreciated seeing people who are third generation starting to get more and more interested in their grandparents' stories, or getting more interested in the community at large. And again, I do credit the Kresy-Siberia Facebook group for that kind of engagement, or also the Twitter, for those of us that still are hanging on to Twitter. There are ways for us to reach the greater Polonia outside, and I think that once people even get that little nugget, I mean, who doesn't love going down the rabbit hole on Google and digging up things? And so people are fascinated. I used Ancestry.com, which is advertised in North America. You only get to so far. You only get to whatever ship brought someone over. Maybe you can find something else. And so there is a sense of erasure there. There is a sense that my family doesn't exist, like before then, where we know it does. And so these are ways that I think that we're going to start looking at the intergenerational and transgenerational transference of these memories and stories, because eventually they're not just memories, they become stories. When I go into the museum space, those aren't my family's memories, but I have similar ones. And so those are the ways that I'm reminded and memorialize and remember my family as I go through a similar type of space. So one of the things that I look at in my research is also events that happened in North America. There's not too many, but I'm looking at, for instance, 9/11 and the trauma there, looking at how there are people that they weren't alive. Their memories only of it, the event, only come from social media and what they've seen, or from hearing their family talk about it. So one of the things that I also want to look is these stories that haven't been told, because unfortunately, history is written by whoever has the power and gets to write the textbooks. And so the Tulsa Race Massacre, Black Wall Street in the United States, completely only revisited now, people in the community knew about it, but there was no museum until just recently, because like you, there was a small group of people that said, we are not going to let this history be erased. And so they continuously told the stories and told people about that story, and little by little, there was able to become recognition. The same thing can be said for the Armenian genocide. It was only just nationally recognized by the United States, of all people, in the last year. There are more stories like this. And especially in Canada, we have residential schools, in Australia also, where there have been children taken away from their families. And it is only because of the people that said, I refuse to forget, I refuse to be erased. And so each time they're sharing, again, a story, an object, they're refusing to be erased. And quite honestly, I think that was Stalin's goal back, early on, and perhaps that's the goal now. But we've already set a path forward for how to stop that from happening. It's because we just keep talking. We just keep sharing our stories. So thank you. I would happily take any questions or if you want to know about any other elements of my research. I have a whole thing about the museum, but I can't tell you about it because I don't want to spoil it for you. So I would just love to hear everyone's experiences after they've gone through the museum to see if any of it resonated maybe in a similar way that it did for me. So that's one area, but yeah, if you ever thought about memory or comic books.
Thank you. That was really interesting. I'm sure there'll be some comments. I actually have one, which is, and I know it's also the terminology is something like the reliability of memory. So my dad didn't really talk about it, but one of the things that he did say on a couple of occasions was, Anna, when we arrived at the train station, there was, all these dead women and children. There was a child who was basically frozen to the mother. And in my mind as a child, this was when they arrived in Russia, and so this was the narrative that I had concocted in my mind. And it wasn't until I was an adult researching that I realized he was deported in April. He would have arrived on the Kazakhstan steppe in late May. That's not what that memory was. And it took me a long time to piece it together, but it was actually something that happened when he went to the Polish army in Totskoy in November 1941. And so I just wonder if you had any thoughts on the unreliability of memory or the unreliability of post-memory when you're maybe trying to assume or read between the lines.
And that's where, I actually had a similar experience here when I realized my understanding of February 10th was wrong. Like, I thought it was late at night, but it was the middle of the morning. But I had concocted this whole narrative in my mind growing up of the same, something similar. And so memory is slippery. But one thing that usually maintains is, if you think about, whatever the date was, for most people I know it was February 10th. Everyone, that type of impactful memory is what they call a flashbulb memory. Kind of like if you say, where were you on 9/11? Everyone remembers. Those are those flashbulb memories. But yeah, over time, they get slippery. And that is, again, why gathering testimonies as early as possible is so important before the slippage. And that's where also historical verification becomes really important, like you did, is kind of checking that. And that's why even in the 80s, especially with Holocaust trauma and genocide academics, there is some fact checking that has to happen to be able to say, well, was that really it, or did that person really die there? So it's just slippery.
Jax.
Thank you so much. This was very interesting, and I can as a third generation, I can relate to a lot of things. Slippery memories and talking with grandparents and all that I can relate to. I have a question. How do you address people who keeps telling you, like, why do you live in the past? Why are you focused on this?
Why are you no fun at parties?
And they want to dismiss that. And how do you reconcile like such feelings with people who, I don't know if you're hearing this from many people, but.
Yeah, it's, I joke that this process has been a bit of an exorcism because it's just been so important to me. But I have a dog, that helps. But people ask about it, and I think because in the West, people genuinely don't know, they're actually quite interested. I participated in the Sybiru Memorial Run, and you have a badge, a number, and I ran. And people stopped and said, "Oh, what are you running for?" And so I got to stop to tell them. And most people are genuinely interested. I think it's anyone who's very close to me that is like, "Man, you done that chapter yet?" You kind of, but I just smile through it. This is who I am. It's literally in my DNA. I couldn't feel more deeply connected to the material, and so you can't run away from it. But you can get a puppy. It helps.
Any other questions? Irena?
Thank you. It was great. I'm a daughter of a Sybiru, and I really, really can see where you're coming from. In New Zealand, I come from New Zealand, we have quite a few dance groups, and recently the young adults group, they did a dance about the Polish children that came to New Zealand, and they performed it in Australia at Pole Art last year, and apparently it was very moving. So these are third generation. And so, I can see that happening, that they're starting to do it as part of theatre.
It's part of the performance. It's also part of that cultural connection. And are they in their Krakowiak? That's also.
They don't have the language, but they have that connection.
And that's me. I don't speak Polish, but I can get by in a restaurant. But that is the connection we have, and I think that AI helps. We can muddle through, but I know in Australia and Melbourne also they have different groups that are connected where there's robust Polish communities, and so that is how we can kind of keep these stories going specifically. So I'm sure that was actually quite beautiful.
I'm Jacques Fazen. My mother was deported, and the problem is she refuses to talk about the deportation. Besides, she had her journal hidden by her sister. She published later on. So there is a break between the memory. My mother used to. She refused to talk about anything related to the past. And then 2 years ago she passed away, and Jacques he wanted to remember all and get the tiny details of her journey. And the thing, what I know from my chochas and from my cousins all over, rather than my mom.
It's like she skipped a generation. She talked more to me than to her sons.
So that's also quite common. For instance, in our family, my babcia didn't talk about it too much, but her sister kind of did, but didn't. And I asked my family, they got dragged into this too. And I said, when did you know, or what did you know? And one of my chochas, my mother's sister, said, "Oh, nobody started talking about anything until you started asking questions." So this was much later, when I was, a teenager, kind of saying, "Well, what happened?" And I think that there was a distance. I think perhaps there's a temporal time. I don't know if there's like a magic decade or so, but where suddenly it's far enough away, or maybe it has to do with. Age, realizing now is the time to talk about it. But I found that same thing too. And I going through this process, I learned a lot about my babcia that I wish, I get it now. Maybe at the time I didn't, but I get it now. And I get some of her behaviors. I get some things. All she wanted was to be recognized. And so when the medal became a thing that could be awarded, I saw a gentleman wearing it. That was her most prized possession, because finally there was acknowledgement of what she endured. And so on her gravestone, I had it put in there. And so we could say survivor of Siberia. And when nation states ignore historical truths, it creates a historical wound. And those historical wounds then are not easy to heal. And so it can be time, sometimes it can be just social acceptance. Maybe it also became more people were kind of talking about it, or thinking about the way governments oppress different populations is also why maybe there's an unsafe feeling. And yeah, that's, I think, I agree, I get it.
Paul.
My father was an orphan in Siberia. His mother and father died there. As a child, I asked very direct questions. What happened to them? How did they die? Where? And I realized after that I think it's important to ask very gentle questions. You know, who did you play with? What did you eat? I think it's the kind of questions we ask that can draw out memories.
No, absolutely. And then sometimes you might get surprised by something when you're driving, and suddenly it's like, there was some daughter before your mom. What? So like, she was the oldest. So like, suddenly there's these random things that'll pop out, and you don't know what people have been thinking of. And so I think that this even goes to the second generation. It's time to share now also. While we can archive these stories. And it is, that same slipperiness with memory, it continues. And so being able to write things down, now it's so easy with phones. You can just, have a conversation, record it, and it audio transcribes it. I think that asking those gentle questions, make it a conversation, not an inquisition. And a lot happens at the kitchen table over a cup of tea or coffee. And I do wonder how do we bring this up with my nieces? Like, how do we talk about this? And I think the museum, again, does a really great job at introducing concepts and scaffolding their engagement with the material and the topic, because it's part of our history. And that doesn't change, but also having a point of pride about it helps make it okay. And so being able to say, no, I'm part of a history you don't even know about.
Any other questions? All right, well, sorry, Yvonne. Yeah.
I've come across the term memory grafting. Is it real? And could you explain a little bit about what it is?
So memory grafting, is it real? I think it's a thought. It's very similar when I said there was post-memory or prosthetic memory. Don't worry about that. So it's very similar, that grafting or a prosthetic memory. It's something that's very much activated in museum spaces and sometimes movies. And it's the idea that if you watch something or learn about something, you kind of take on those memories yourself, even though the experiences in a way that you've never experienced them, but you feel them very deeply. And that can come a large part from just feeling deep empathy. So, for instance, I use the example of 9/11 in my chapter, talking about how there's people that have no memories of 9/11 on their own, but when they see the memories, I don't know if you've seen the performance, the musical Come From Away. It's a musical about people that were in Gander, Newfoundland during the days after 9/11, but it's told as recollections. And so audiences all over the world love the show. How many people are hearing their memories performed, and then now that's kind of all they have? That becomes their memories of 9/11 through what they saw. So that's a bit of that grafting, or as Alison Landsberg calls it, a prosthetic.
I think actually there's, it possibly even happened with the generation who went through Siberia. So for example, my dad was 14 when he got out with Andrew's army and volunteered for the Polish Navy. He obviously lied about his age by 5 years. So he was only 14 years old when he was on the Murmansk convoys. And during the Falklands War, when the Belgrano was sunk, he was very upset and distressed and was crying to me saying, "Anna, you don't understand, there were people burning, falling off the ship." And he talked about how he had served on ORP Orkan. And so I had always understood it to be that he was a survivor from Orkan when it was sunk in the Atlantic. So I went to the Sikorsky Museum and I got the list of survivors, and he wasn't on the list. And so the only thing I can work out is that he was only 14 years old. He was on ORP Garland in end of 1943-44, on which many of the survivors from Orkan would have then been transferred onto that destroyer. And has he approximated their memories of watching burning people fall from the ship? You know, did he do it knowingly on purpose? Did he think that those memories were his? Because the trauma was very real, and until you mentioned memory grafting or prosthetic memory, I had not put like a terminology to what perhaps that was. So
exactly, and that was what prosthetic memory was, the first theory that I entered into this whole study with, thinking, oh, well, my chocha's memories are like my memories, so they're a prosthetic memory. But because there's a generational connection, it's not the same. So the grafting or the prosthetic would have to be with two completely different groups. And so that's just getting into the nuance, but essentially it's taking on one's memories that aren't your own, but not even because you were raised with them. And it can be good, it can be bad, everything can be used, differently in different ways.
Thank you. I think it's fascinating, and I think we could probably all talk for hours about it, and we probably will later on. So thank you very much, Alison.